Tanner Hughes had spent his life with questions no one could answer. Who was his father? Why had his mother never spoken of him? And why did it feel like the truth had been deliberately hidden from him? Raised by his grandparents in a quiet Tennessee town, Tanner had accepted the absence of his parents as an unchangeable part of his story. His mother, Charlotte, had died giving birth to him. His father was a ghost, a name that had never been spoken in their house. But after his grandfather passed away, Tanner found something he wasn't supposed to see: an old, worn letter buried deep in a locked trunk. The handwriting was careful, precise. It wasn't his mother's. "Charlotte, I can't let them keep me away forever. I swear. I'll find a way back to you and the baby. If anything happens, tell him I never stopped trying." No signature. No return address. Just a single postmark, Asheboro, North Carolina. That was all it took. Tanner packed his bags the next day, his mind set on one thing: finding the truth. He wasn't looking for a fairy tale ending. He wasn't even sure what he hoped to find. But he knew one thing: he couldn't keep living in the dark. The road to Asheboro stretched ahead of him, winding through forests and past small-town diners. The kind of places where everyone knew each other's business. A place where secrets didn't stay buried forever. It didn't take long for him to find his father's name: Robert Calloway. Dead. A man Tanner had spent years imagining, wondering if he was good or bad, a drifter or a dreamer, was already gone. And with him, any chance of answers. Or so Tanner thought. The deeper he dug, the more the past refused to stay buried. People in Asheboro still whispered about the Calloways, about the power they had wielded in the town for generations, and about the scandal that had sent Robert away before Tanner was even born. But it wasn't just whispers Tanner found. There were connections he hadn't expected, people who seemed to know more than they let on. Like Jasper Johnson, the reclusive old man who lived on the edge of the Uwharrie National Forest, had once been close to Robert Calloway. Too close. And whether he liked it or not, Tanner wasn't leaving Asheboro without answers. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that legacies weren't just passed down. They were buried. And someone in this town had made sure his father's stayed that way. Chapter 2. A hero's timely rescue. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Asheboro's quiet streets held an eerie stillness, the kind that made danger seem like a distant possibility. But for Casey Cooper, that illusion was about to shatter. She had stayed out later than she should have, lost in conversation with friends at a local cafe. Her mother, Caitlin, had always warned her about being careful, about staying aware. But teenagers believed they were invincible, until they weren't. The shortcut through the alley behind the cafe was supposed to save her time. Instead, it led her straight into the path of trouble. 3 men stood at the far end of the alley, their laughter sharp and edged with something dark. Casey's heart quickened. She didn't recognize them, but she didn't need to. Instinct screamed at her to turn back, but it was too late. Well, one of them drawled, stepping forward. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here alone?" Casey clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand tall. "I was just leaving." One of the men moved to block her path. "No rush. We were just getting started." Fear coiled in her stomach. Her hand slipped into her pocket, gripping her phone. But before she could react, a shadow moved at the alley's entrance. "Let her go." The voice was low, controlled, but laced with a quiet danger that made the air feel heavier. The men turned, startled by the interruption. Standing beneath the dim glow of the street lamp was Tanner Hughes. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, but Casey saw the tension in his shoulders. The way his fists curled at his sides. He wasn't just any passerby. He had assessed the situation and was ready to act. The tallest of the three men sneered. "Mind your business, pal." Tanner took a slow step forward, his gaze never wavering. "That's the problem. This is my business." Something in his voice, his unwavering certainty, made the men hesitate. Tanner had the look of someone who had seen worse, done worse, and walked away from it. He wasn't afraid. One of them cursed under his breath. "Forget it. She ain't worth it." Casey didn't breathe until they turned and disappeared into the night. Only then did her knees nearly buckle, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "You okay?" Tanner's voice was softer now, the edge gone. She nodded shakily. "Yeah, I think so." Tanner studied her for a moment before exhaling. "Come on. Let's get you home." By the time they reached her house, Caitlin was already on the porch, worry etched deep in her face. The moment she saw Casey, relief flooded her expression, followed by something sharper when she noticed Tanner. "What happened?" Caitlin demanded. Casey hesitated, glancing at Tanner. He gave a small nod, letting her decide how much to share. "Some guys followed me," she admitted. Tanner helped. Caitlin's eyes darted to him, a flicker of gratitude and something unreadable in them. "Thank you." Tanner shrugged. Just in the right place at the right time. But Caitlin knew better. Sometimes, the right people showed up exactly when they were needed. And something told her Tanner Hughes wasn't here by accident. Chapter 3. A Forbidden Past. Caitlin Cooper had always known that some secrets in Asheboro were better left undisturbed. The past had a way of shaping the present, and in her family, history wasn't just remembered, it was guarded. That's why, when Tanner Hughes walked into her life, something deep inside her stirred. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, or the quiet intensity in his eyes, it was something more, something familiar. And then she learned his name. Hughes. The realization sent a chill through her. Because years ago, there had been another man with that name, one whose presence in her family's story had been erased like a stain on an otherwise perfect legacy. Robert Calloway. The name was spoken in hushed tones. A cautionary tale of what happened when someone defied the Calloway family's carefully constructed world. Caitlin had grown up hearing the whispers about how her grandfather, Richard Calloway, had once had a daughter he barely acknowledged. Charlotte. A woman who had defied him, who had loved the wrong man, and who had paid the price. Now, decades later, that woman's son was standing in front of her. Tanner was looking for answers about his father. He had no idea that Caitlin was part of the story. She tried to ignore it, to pretend that it didn't matter. But every time Tanner was near, the weight of the past pressed heavier on her. He wasn't just a man she was growing to care about. He was living proof of a scandal her family had buried. And the deeper their connection grew, the harder it became to keep the truth from him. One evening, as they sat on her porch, the air thick with summer heat, Tanner glanced at her, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Caitlin's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. It's just a feeling." She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say everything. That his father hadn't just left, he had been forced out. That her grandfather had made sure the Calloway name remained untainted, no matter the cost. But the words stuck in her throat. Because if she told him, there would be no turning back. Some truths, once spoken, could never be undone. And in Ashborough, some pasts were meant to stay buried. Chapter 4. The guardian of the white deer. Jasper Johnson had spent decades living on the edge of civilization, tucked away in the depths of the Uwharrie National Forest. The world had taken everything from him, and he had returned the favor, choosing solitude over society, silence over meaningless conversation. But there was one thing that tethered him to life. One thing that gave him purpose in a way nothing else had. The white deer. A creature of legend in Ashborough, it was said that those who saw the rare albino deer were blessed with luck. That it was a sign of something greater. For Jasper, it was neither luck nor legend, it was survival. Protecting the deer had become his unspoken mission, a redemption he hadn't realized he needed. The first time he saw it, the fawn had been no more than a trembling shadow in the trees, its mother lost to a hunter's bullet. Jasper had watched it from a distance, knowing nature had its way of sorting things out. But when he found it days later, weakened and alone, something inside him refused to walk away. So he didn't. He nursed it back to strength, ensured it had food, and kept watch as it grew. And when it was strong enough, it returned to the wild, but never too far from Jasper's cabin. Over the years, the deer had become more than just an animal to him. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something pure could still exist. Not everyone saw it that way. Poachers had long sought the deer, drawn by greed or the thrill of the hunt. But as long as Jasper lived and breathed, they would never touch it. He had fought off more than one intruder, made it clear that the white deer was not to be hunted. Most men in town had learned to leave him alone. But not all of them. And as he stood on his porch one evening, staring at the set of boot prints leading too close to his land, Jasper knew trouble was coming. This time, it wouldn't be just another warning. This time, someone was going to get hurt. Chapter 5. The fire that changed everything. The night the fire started, Jasper Johnson had been out by the creek, setting traps for the raccoons that had been raiding his garden. He hadn't smelled the smoke at first, hadn't seen the glow rising above the trees. But when the wind shifted, the acrid scent filled his lungs, and dread coiled in his gut. He ran. His cabin was old, built by his own hands decades ago. But it wasn't just wood and nails that mattered. It was what was inside. The memories. The last traces of the life he had built before everything had been ripped away. By the time he reached the clearing, flames had already consumed the porch, licking at the walls, turning everything he owned into a funeral pyre. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with fury. Someone had done this. This wasn't an accident. Jasper knew the land, knew fire and wind. It had been set deliberately. And he knew why. The white deer. For years, poachers had tried to claim it, to turn it into nothing more than a trophy. Jasper had fought them off, made enemies he didn't care to count. But now, they had escalated. They hadn't been able to get to the deer, so they had come for him instead. He stumbled forward, coughing against the thick smoke, knowing there was nothing to save. The heat was unbearable, pushing him back, forcing him to watch as his past burned to ash. Then came the crack of a branch, a rustle in the darkness. He wasn't alone. Jasper turned sharply, his instincts razor-sharp despite his age. Shadows moved beyond the fire's glow, figures slipping between trees. He wasn't sure if they had stayed to watch or if they had realized their mistake, because they hadn't killed him. Not yet. Gritting his teeth, Jasper clenched his fists. If they thought they could scare him into submission, they were dead wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 6. blood ties and betrayals. Tanner Hughes had spent his life searching for a truth he was never meant to find. But as he pieced together fragments of his father's past, he realized that some answers carried the weight of betrayal. Jasper Johnson wasn't just a stranger with a tragic past. He had known Tanner's father, knew him in ways no one else did. And that knowledge came with secrets, the kind that could change everything Tanner thought he knew about himself. It started with an old photograph. Jasper had been reluctant to talk, but something in Tanner's persistence had worn him down. Late one evening, by the dim glow of a lantern in Jasper's cabin, the old man had dug into a rusted tin box and pulled out a weathered photograph. Tanner's breath hitched. It was his father, Robert Calloway, young and full of life, standing beside a man with familiar, stormy eyes. "Jasper, you knew him," Tanner whispered, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the photo. Jasper exhaled slowly, nodding. "More than that. I raised him." The words hit Tanner like a fist to the gut. "What?" Jasper leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with memories. "Your father wasn't the man people painted him to be. He didn't abandon you, Tanner. He was forced to leave." Tanner felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always believed his father had walked away willingly, that he had chosen to disappear. But now, who forced him? Tanner demanded. Jasper's gaze darkened. "The same man who forced me out of town years before. The same man who controlled everything in this place." Tanner didn't have to ask. He already knew. Caitlin's grandfather. The realization sent a surge of anger through him. The man had not only destroyed his father's life but had taken something from Jasper, too. And now, decades later, Tanner had unknowingly walked straight into the tangled web his family had left behind. Jasper's voice was rough when he spoke again. "Robert loved your mother. But that wasn't enough for the Calloways. They had other plans for her. Plans that didn't include a man like him." Tanner clenched his fists. He had spent his life looking for answers, but nothing had prepared him for this. His father had been torn away, not by choice, but by power and greed. By a betrayal so deep it had left scars on generations. He thought of Caitlin, of the feelings growing between them. And for the first time, he wondered if history was on the verge of repeating itself. Blood ties ran deep in this town. And so did betrayals. Chapter 7. A love triangle from the past. Caitlin had always believed in fate, but she never imagined it would come knocking in the form of Tanner Hughes. The deeper she fell for him, the more the past clawed its way to the surface, threatening to unravel everything. Her mother had once told her love could be as dangerous as it was beautiful. Now, she understood why. It started with whispers, fragments of stories she had overheard as a child but never fully understood. A scandal, a betrayal, a love that had shaken the very foundations of the Calloway family. And at the center of it all, three names: Charlotte, Robert, and Richard. Tanner's mother, Charlotte, hadn't just defied the Calloway name. She had been caught between two men: Robert Calloway, the man she had loved, and Richard Calloway, the man who had tried to control her fate. Caitlin's grandfather had never forgiven Charlotte for choosing love over duty, for refusing to marry the man he had deemed worthy. And when she had gotten pregnant with Robert's child, Richard had made sure they would never have a future together. Now, decades later, the past was repeating itself. As Caitlin traced the old newspaper clippings she had unearthed from her family's archives, her hands trembled. The truth was uglier than she had imagined. Robert hadn't abandoned Charlotte. He had been forced out, driven away under the weight of threats no man could stand against. And when he had tried to return, he had vanished. His fate sealed by the very man who had called himself family. And now Tanner was here, unknowingly entangled in the same cruel cycle. Caitlin loved him. But the weight of history pressed against her chest. If her grandfather had been willing to destroy Robert to protect the Calloway name, what would he do to Tanner if he discovered the truth? She had to make a choice. Love or legacy. But as she looked into Tanner's eyes, she knew one thing: fate wasn't finished with them yet. And this time? She wasn't sure love would be enough to change what was coming. Chapter 8. The Stalker in the Shadows. Tanner had always trusted his instincts. They had kept him alive on the battlefield, guiding him through situations where hesitation meant death. But now, those instincts were screaming at him again, louder than ever. Someone was watching him. It started with the subtle things. A lingering gaze from across the street. The feeling of being followed when he walked through town. The way his truck's side mirror had been cracked, though he could have sworn it was fine the night before. At first, he chalked it up to paranoia. He was new in town, stirring up old ghosts, asking the kind of questions that made people uncomfortable. But then it escalated. A note tucked beneath his windshield wiper. Go home while you still can. His gut tightened. This wasn't just resistance to an outsider digging up family history. This was a warning. And warnings always came before something worse. He told himself he wouldn't let it get to him. But then Caitlin found the second note. This one pinned to her front door. Stay away from him. She had tried to brush it off, insisting it was nothing. But Tanner saw the fear behind her eyes. She knew, just as he did, that someone in Asheboro wanted the past buried. And they were willing to do whatever it took to keep it that way. One night, as he left Caitlin's house, he saw it. The shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching. The moment Tanner took a step forward, the figure slipped into the woods, vanishing into the darkness. His pulse pounded. This wasn't random intimidation. This was personal. Someone knew who he was. Someone knew why he was here. And they were willing to make sure he never got the answers he was looking for. Chapter 9. The Showdown in the Woods. The forest was silent, but Tanner knew better. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, before something terrible happened. He gripped the flashlight in one hand, his other hovering near the knife strapped to his belt. Whoever had been watching him, leaving threats, trying to scare him away, had finally made their move. And he wasn't running. Caitlin's panicked voice still rang in his ears from the phone call minutes ago. They took Jasper. They're after the deer. That was all he needed to hear. He'd barely stopped to think before jumping into his truck, speeding toward the Uwharrie National Forest. Jasper had spent his life protecting that animal, and now, someone was using it to get to him. Branches whipped against Tanner's arms as he moved through the underbrush. He could hear voices ahead, low, urgent. The glow of firelight flickered between the trees. He crept closer. His breath steady, his heartbeat anything but. Jasper was on his knees in the clearing, his hands bound. Two men stood over him, their faces shadowed by the firelight. And behind them, in a crude makeshift trap, was the white deer, its pale coat shimmering against the darkness, its frightened eyes darting wildly. One of the men pulled out a rifle, aiming it directly at the animal. Rage exploded in Tanner's chest. "No!" he shouted, stepping into the firelight. The men spun around, startled. Jasper's head snapped up, his weathered face tightening with urgency. "Tanner! Get out of here!" But Tanner wasn't going anywhere. One of the poachers, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his cheek, raised his gun. "Walk away," he warned. "This ain't your fight." Tanner smirked. "It is now." The moment stretched, tense and brittle. Then, In a blur of movement, Tanner lunged. The fight was fast and brutal. A fist connected with his ribs, but he barely registered the pain. He twisted, knocking the gun from the man's grasp. The other attacker swung at him with a hunting knife, but Tanner dodged, sending the man sprawling to the ground with a sharp kick to the knee. Jasper, fueled by sheer defiance, threw himself at the remaining poacher, knocking him off balance just long enough for Tanner to seize control. Within seconds, both men were subdued. Groaning on the forest floor, the deer let out a panicked cry, its hooves scraping against the trap's wooden bars. Tanner hurried to release it, his hands working quickly. As soon as the last latch was undone, the deer bolted into the woods, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Jasper exhaled shakily. That animal was never meant to be caged. Neither was the truth. As the distant wail of sirens cut through the air, Tanner looked at the beaten men before him. This wasn't just about a deer. This was about power, secrets, and the people who thought they could control both. But the past had finally caught up with them, and Tanner wasn't leaving until he got every answer he came for. Chapter 10. The final miracle. The sun was just beginning to rise over Asheboro when Tanner sat on the hospital's front steps, his bruised hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he barely tasted. The night had been long, filled with questions, statements, and the quiet understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. Jasper was alive. Beaten, but alive. The poachers had been arrested, and the sheriff had more than enough evidence to keep them locked away for a long time. But the true miracle wasn't in the justice served, it was in the way the past had finally unraveled, revealing a truth that had been buried for far too long. Caitlin stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself as the cool morning air brushed against her skin. She looked at Tanner, studying the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything they had been through. "They're going to be okay," she said softly. "Jasper, the deer, even us." Tanner exhaled slowly, nodding. Yeah. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Not just in Asheboro, but with Caitlin. With Jasper. With the tangled history that had led him here. To a place he never thought he'd call home. A rustle in the trees caught his attention. He looked up, and for a brief moment, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the white deer, unharmed, watching. Caitlin followed his gaze and let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You know what they say," she murmured. "Seeing the white deer is a sign of a miracle." Tanner smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. Maybe it was a miracle, not just the deer's survival, but his own. He had spent his whole life searching for something, and in the end, it had led him right here. He reached for Caitlin's hand, lacing their fingers together as the deer turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving nothing behind but hope. Some miracles, after all, weren't meant to be counted. They were meant to be lived.